1964. While American engineers debated whether high-speed rail was even possible, Japan answered the question. On the first day of October, the Shinkansen bullet train carried its first passengers from Tokyo to Osaka at 130 miles per hour. The world watched in astonishment. America watched in something else. Humiliation. We had invented modern rail. We had built the locomotives that tamed a continent. And now, a nation we had defeated 19 years earlier was showing us the future of ground transportation. Washington noticed. Congress acted. And for one brief moment, it seemed like America would reclaim the rails. Until it decided not to. The problem facing American transportation in the early 1960s was not abstract. It was visceral, measurable, and growing worse by the month. The Northeast Corridor, that densely populated ribbon of cities stretching from Boston through New York to Washington, was choking on its own success. More than 17% of the entire American population lived on less than 2% of its land. Every weekday morning, millions of commuters fought their way into city centers. Every weekday evening, they fought their way back out. The highways were gridlocked, the airports were overwhelmed, and the railroads, once the arteries of American commerce, were bleeding passengers to death. Senator Claiborne Pell of Rhode Island understood this crisis more intimately than most politicians in Washington. A frequent rider of the trains connecting his home state to the capital, Pell watched the deterioration firsthand. He saw the aging cars, some dating back to before the First World War. He experienced the delays, the cancellations, the general atmosphere of managed decline. But where others saw a dying industry, Pell saw an opportunity. In 1962, he began advocating publicly for something radical. He envisioned the Northeast not as a collection of rival cities, but as one continuous metropolitan industrial unit. And he believed that trains, not highways and not airplanes, held the key to connecting that unit into a coherent whole. Pell called the rail line between Boston and Washington a passageway for gargantuan surges of movement along our northeast seaboard. He gave this passageway a name that would endure. He called it the Corridor. The senator urged President Kennedy to create a government agency that would operate passenger trains for the public good. He argued that rail was not obsolete, but rather underinvested. Given proper funding and modern technology, American trains could compete with the automobile and the airplane alike. His colleagues listened politely. Most remained skeptical. Then Japan changed everything. The Shinkansen was not merely fast, it was transformative. The bullet train cut travel time between Tokyo and Osaka from 6 hours to approximately 3. Within its first year of operation, ridership exploded from 10 million passengers to levels that kept climbing annually. By 1970, 80 million Japanese citizens were riding the Shinkansen every year. By the mid-70s, that number would reach 120 million. And here was the detail that stung most deeply in Washington. The system recorded 0 passenger fatalities, not one. The Japanese had not merely built a train, they had reimagined ground transportation from first principles, creating dedicated tracks, advanced signaling systems, and lightweight cars designed for speed rather than collision survival. Congress felt the sting of wounded pride. The United States had pioneered railroad technology in the 19th century. American locomotives had opened the West. American rail barons had built empires. And now America was being outclassed by a nation that had been in ruins 2 decades earlier. The High-Speed Ground Transportation Act of 1965 passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. Only 23 members of the House of Representatives voted against it out of 432 total votes. President Lyndon Johnson signed the legislation and personally thanked Senator Pell for his persistence in pushing the act through Congress and repeatedly bringing the issue to presidential attention. The act authorized $90 million over 3 years for the creation of an Office of High-Speed Ground Transportation within the Department of Commerce. The legislation mandated research and development into advanced rail technologies. It established a demonstration program designed to measure public response to high-speed service, and it specifically targeted the Northeast Corridor as the proving ground for America's rail renaissance. The vision was clear. The funding was secured. The political will existed. America would build its own bullet train. The centerpiece of this effort became the Metroliner. The Pennsylvania Railroad, working with the Budd Company, General Electric, and Westinghouse, developed an electric self-propelled rail car designed specifically for high-speed service between New York and Washington. The Department of Transportation contributed $11.5 million to the project. The Pennsylvania Railroad invested an additional $44.5 million. A final contract of $21 million went to the manufacturers who would actually build the equipment. On the 6th of May, 1966, the Pennsylvania Railroad placed a substantial order for Metroliner cars. The future seemed to be arriving on schedule. The cars were designed to reach 160 miles per hour, making them among the fastest passenger vehicles on Earth at the time. High-level platforms were constructed at stations in Wilmington, Baltimore, and Washington to enable faster boarding. The Pennsylvania Railroad selected the Metroliner name and announced that the service would carry premium fares reflecting its premium speed. Everything was proceeding according to plan. And then everything started to fall apart. The first Metroliner cars arrived in September of 1967. Almost immediately, serious electrical problems emerged. Engineers discovered that the sophisticated power systems were unreliable. The cars suffered from arcing, overheating, and a host of technical failures that had not appeared in testing. The scheduled start of service was pushed from January of 1968 to an indefinite future date. Meanwhile, the Pennsylvania Railroad itself was dying. On the 1st of February 1968, the Pennsylvania Railroad merged with its longtime rival, the New York Central Railroad, creating the Penn Central Transportation Company. On paper, this was the largest corporate merger in American history. Two legendary railroads, each with routes spanning the northeastern quarter of the nation, combining their resources to create an unstoppable transportation giant. In reality, the merger combined two dying companies into one doomed corporation. The Pennsylvania and the New York Central had been bleeding money for years. Competition from trucks and automobiles had devastated their freight business. Competition from automobiles and airlines had gutted their passenger revenues. By merging, they hoped to eliminate redundant routes and reduce costs. Instead, they combined incompatible corporate cultures, incompatible equipment, and incompatible expectations into a catastrophe of historic proportions. The Metroliner project continued despite the chaos. On the 15th of January 1969, a press run carried VIPs from Washington to New York. The following day, revenue service finally began with a single daily round trip. A second round trip was added in February. By April, a nonstop service on a 2.5-hour schedule demonstrated what American rail could achieve when given the chance. Despite persistent mechanical difficulties, the service proved overwhelmingly popular. By May, the Metroliners were achieving 90% on-time performance. Ridership exceeded all projections. Business travelers who had abandoned rail for air travel began returning. The Metroliner averaged 90.1 miles per hour between New York and Washington, faster than even the Acela Express trains that would operate between those same cities more than 4 decades later in 2012. Sold-out trains became the norm rather than the exception on Fridays and Sundays. The success rippled outward, increasing ridership even on conventional trains and creating pressure to expand the Metroliner schedule. America had proven it could compete with Japan. The question now was whether America wanted to. The answer came on the 21st of June, 1970. Penn Central Transportation Company filed for bankruptcy. At that moment, it was the largest corporate bankruptcy in American history. The company controlled over 20,000 miles of track. It moved one-third of the nation's passenger trains and much of the freight in the northeastern United States. It operated the Metroliner service that had just demonstrated the viability of American high-speed rail. And it was financially dead. What comes next is there something you ever experienced? The bankruptcy shocked Wall Street. It shocked Washington. But the American public, consumed by the ongoing Vietnam War, paid surprisingly little attention. Most citizens asked only whether the passenger trains would continue running. They did, barely. But the larger dream of high-speed rail expansion died in that bankruptcy filing. Penn Central had been the vehicle through which America was supposed to build its rail future. Now Penn Central was gone. The causes of the collapse were numerous and interconnected. The merged company inherited duplicate routes serving the same markets in an era when deindustrialization was hollowing out those markets. Management from the Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central clashed constantly, with the Penn Central chairman allegedly referring to the company president as the worst enemy he had ever encountered. The Interstate Commerce Commission had refused to approve rate increases even as inflation ate into revenues. Labor rules required employing workers the railroads no longer needed. And the federal government had spent $25 billion building 41,000 miles of interstate highways that directly competed with rail for both passengers and freight. Between 1956 and 1969, the nation opened 28,800 miles of new highway. During that same period, 59,400 miles of railroad were closed to passenger service. The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. America had chosen the automobile. America had chosen the airplane. Rail would receive $90 million to prove its worth. Highways would receive billions every single year, with federal funding covering 90% of construction costs, while states paid only 10%. The bankruptcy forced the federal government to intervene. In May of 1971, Congress created Amtrak to relieve Penn Central and other failing railroads of their passenger service obligations. Amtrak inherited the Metroliner service. It inherited the Northeast Corridor infrastructure. And it inherited a fundamental contradiction that persists to this day. The rails belonged to a quasi-public corporation that was supposed to operate without adequate funding on infrastructure built a century earlier. The appropriations from the High-Speed Ground Transportation Act of 1965 ran out in 1975. Congressional attention shifted to maintaining basic service rather than achieving genuine high-speed performance. The vision of American bullet trains, of routes connecting every major metropolitan region at speeds competitive with air travel, quietly faded from political discourse. The demonstration project had demonstrated what was possible. America simply chose not to pursue it. 60 years after Japan launched the Shinkansen, the Northeast Corridor remains America's busiest passenger rail line. It carries more than 2,200 trains daily. Over 820,000 passengers ride those trains on an average weekday. But much of the infrastructure dates back to the era between the Civil War and the New Deal. Bridges and tunnels that were built when Theodore Roosevelt occupied the White House continue to support 21st century service. The state of good repair backlog currently exceeds $38 billion. The Osaka, America's fastest train, averages approximately 82 miles per hour between New York and Washington. The Japanese Shinkansen averages 177 miles per hour. After 6 decades of operation, the Shinkansen has still never recorded a single passenger fatality. The story of American high-speed rail is not a story of technological failure. The Metroliner worked, the ridership materialized, the demand existed and continues to exist. It is a story of political choice. America chose highways. America chose airports. America chose to let its railroads decline, while competitors in Japan, France, Germany, China, and a dozen other nations built networks that make American service look antiquated by comparison. Senator Claiborne Pell served in the United States Senate until 1997. He watched the high-speed rail future he had championed recede further with each passing decade. He watched other nations build the systems America had once planned to build. He watched the corridor he had named continue to carry millions of passengers on infrastructure that grew older and more fragile with each passing year. The vision was never wrong. The technology was never impossible. The politics simply chose a different direction. Today, when you board an Amtrak train at Penn Station in New York, you descend into tunnels that are over 113 years old. The concrete is cracked, the systems are patched. The trains that pass through those tunnels travel slower than the Metroliners that ran in 1969. Billions of dollars are now being invested to repair what should have been replaced generations ago. Perhaps the next generation will finally ride American trains at speeds the Japanese achieved before most of them were born. But you remember 1965. You remember when Congress voted overwhelmingly to build something extraordinary. You remember the photographs of those Metroliners, sleek and silver, promising a future that never quite arrived. What might this nation look like today if we had followed through? If the bankruptcy had not killed the momentum, if the highways had not swallowed the funding, if we had chosen rails over roads when the choice was still ours to make. Did you ever ride a Metroliner? Did you ever imagine taking a train from New York to Washington in 90 minutes? And do you believe that America will ever build what Japan built 60 years ago?